Hello, I'm Sal Mercogliano. I'm an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina. I am a maritime historian, former merchant mariner. I teach courses in maritime history, maritime security, and maritime industry policy. And I'm coming to you today on National Maritime Day. Every year since 1933, May 22nd has been set aside as National Maritime Day. The U.S. Congress, 2 days prior to that, passed a joint resolution through the Senate recognizing the role and contribution of merchant mariners to the history, the present, and the future of the United States. Today, the Maritime Administration held an event commemorating National Maritime Day. Of course, with COVID-19, it wasn't live, it was recorded. I think one of the things that MARAD does is really recognize National Maritime Day well. However, I wanted to follow up on that because I think one of the things that is missing is the history of the U.S. Merchant Marine, and more importantly, the role it plays in both the present and the future. When National Maritime Day was passed in 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt endorsed this recognition of the maritime industry. His family on both sides, the Delanos and the Roosevelts, were very ingrained in shipping. Matter of fact, there were shipping lines that both their families were involved with. During World War I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He operated for the Navy in terms of the military sea lift, what was necessary to get the ships over. And under the Wilson administration, Franklin Roosevelt learned a lot of the deficiencies that the United States faced. When war was declared in 1914, the United States didn't get involved. We declared ourselves neutral. However, the bulk of our shipping was carried on foreign vessels, much like today. As British ships vacated our ports to focus on the concentration of supporting the Allies in World War I, they were the largest merchant marine in the world. Over half the ships on the high seas flew the British flag. The next largest merchant marine, the Germans, were sought after by the British, and the German fleet had to seek cover and take itself out of the commerce of the world economy, leaving the United States without sufficient ships to haul and move goods. And the United States found itself in a quandary. It really felt itself at the mercy of foreign shipping. And in 1916, the Shipping Act was passed in an effort to spur up and start international shipping. Fortunately, the Shipping Act was in place so that when the United States did get into the war in 1917 through German actions, the United States was able to ramp up and build up a shipbuilding program and haul over a good chunk of its troops and supplies during the First World War. However, 55% of the entire American Expeditionary Force was transported by foreign shipping. And at the end of World War I, the United States found themselves really at the mercy of the British when it came to negotiations at Versailles over the issue of the repatriation of the American Expeditionary Force. Fast forward to World War II, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1933, sees the war clouds on the horizon in Europe and Asia. The United States is still in that same position where it's really dependent upon foreign shipping for most of its commerce. And the United States passes the Merchant Marine Act of 1936 in an effort to spur up ship construction. In 1933, only 4 merchant ships were built in the entire United States. In the following 2 years, only 2 were built each year. But the Merchant Marine Act of 1936 starts a shipbuilding program that will not only rebuild the Merchant Marine, it'll eventually construct over 5,000 vessels, but it'll also ramp up shipyards, ship construction, so that when the Navy needs the Two-Ocean Navy, which is passed in 1940, the Two-Ocean Navy Act, then the shipyards are ready to go. And now all of a sudden the United States is in a position where it can move ahead. Go to today. Now the world is gripped by COVID-19, the coronavirus. And one of the things we're seeing is the vital role that shipping plays in keeping our supply chain alive. We saw the initial impact of the coronavirus by the slowdown of goods coming out of China and the Far East. Now we're seeing that impact here in the United States. We saw it on board cruise ships. First indicators we saw of the coronavirus was those impacts on cruise ships. And within the United States, the U.S. Merchant Marine, the largest employer of the U.S. Merchant Marine, which is the Navy's military sea lift command, basically ordered a gangway up on March 21st, followed by many other shipping companies, basically restricting mariners on board their vessels in order to protect them. That doesn't mean they're all protected. We've recently seen an outbreak on board a ship in the shipyard up in Boston, the USNS Leroy Grumman, where a good chunk of that crew has been infected. But one of the big issues we see is the impact of the Jones Act. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which was passed shortly after World War I, was a holistic Merchant Marine Act. It was aimed to provide many things. It certified the protection of coastal trade. It got the war-built fleet of ships built by the U.S. Shipping Board onto international routes. It codified the Lafayette Seamen's Act to make sure that American mariners are the best protected mariners in the world. And we've seen over time, since the 1920s, provisions and the foundations that the American maritime industry is built upon eroded over time. Slowly but surely, we see legs knocked out from underneath that foundation to the point we're at today, where there's very little that's really the U.S. merchant fleet. If you look at the U.S. merchant fleet today, there's components of it. A large chunk of it is government-owned in supporting the U.S. Navy. 1 out of 5 U.S. Navy ships have merchant mariners as their crew members. These aren't government contractors. Government contractors are not in the chain of command of vessels within the U.S. Navy. Merchant mariners are. You have the Maritime Security Program, 60 ships that receive funding to keep them U.S. flag and involved in international trade to ensure we have supply lines and networks overseas so that we can support American forces in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe. We have the Jones Act, ensures that 100 ships remain within the U.S. intercoastal cabotage trade, a very vital component. Those ships provide trade between U.S. states and U.S. territories, but they also provide mariners that can be used to crew up the 61 vessels in the Ready Reserve fleet. And all of those components make up the U.S. maritime structure. But understand, the U.S. maritime structure is in danger. It's in extremis. It's in poor shape. Right now at NASCO in San Diego, the MV Matsonia is being built. It's a replacement vessel for Matson lines. Kauai was taken under tow to be scrapped in Texas. But after Matsonia is built, there's no other commercial deep draft vessels on the order books in American yards. And this is a case we're seeing worldwide. Worldwide shipping orders are going down, but more importantly, worldwide shipping is being concentrated in the hands of just a few places: China, Korea, Japan, the Philippines. Those 4 countries control 94% of all the ships built in the world. The remaining 6% are spread out over the globe. And one of the fears is that production, that construction will become localized there in East Asia, and we will be not just ships being built from there, but also being repaired from there. And the U.S. will find itself in a situation it found itself in on the eve of World War I, hence the reason for the passage of the first Merchant Marine Act in 1920. We've seen merchant mariners doing great things during the COVID-19 outbreak. We saw merchant mariners break out ships like the USNS Mercy and Comfort, hospital ships that were sent to Los Angeles and New York City. 70 crew members on board those ships are merchant mariners. Those are some of that 20% of U.S. Navy ships that have civilian crews on board. We've seen U.S. merchant mariners continue the movement of goods along the coastal trade, in the inland waterways, along the coast, the bays, in harbors, all throughout the United States. But at the same time, we've seen globally foreign flag ships come into a lot of problems with crew rotations. Crews are now being kept on the ships through extremely long periods of time, from 9 months to 1 year in some cases. And there's a good chance that we can see a breakdown in the global trade system. And so recognizing U.S. maritime industry is a very important element. And this National Maritime Day, it's important. 87 years since the very first National Maritime Day. But we're becoming to a point where these National Maritime Days may be commemoration events for past events, not for present or future. And they need